Hey everybody, welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about how I rig up my Keiryu rods to actually use them as a Keiryu rod as opposed to a big Tenkara rod. All this information is coming from Tenkara Bum's website. I'll put a link in the description to the page on Keiryu lines, and he talks about the line construction as well. But lots and lots of good information there. And there's some good information elsewhere. It's just where I happen to learn mine. If you've seen some of my other videos, you know I use a lot of these rods, and I'll use them out from, 17 feet, like this Swanabori 53, out to almost 24 feet with the 72. And then also the Fine Power 66 is also another long one. So anyways, I have a bunch of them. I really like them. I love the sensitivity. The majority of the time I use them like a big Tenkara rod. Even though they're stiffer in the mid and lower section, they have a very, flexible tip. So whether I'm using them two-handed or one-handed, they cast a 3.5 line very, very nicely. So you can get a lot of reach with them, and without the cork grip, you can get a lot of sensitivity, so you can feel those taps, and they fight really well. A lot of leverage on the fish, and great for big fish, even with smaller tippets, say 5X. Today we're going to talk about how I use it when I'm not using it as a Tenkara rod, and more for what it was designed for. So I mentioned, stiffer mid and lower sections. The Keiryu rods were designed really to be used with bait. So they'll have a small hook, turn over rocks, get worms or nymphs, caddis larvae, things like that, right out of the water, and put them on a very fine hook with a split shot above it. So they're designed for using weight, which is why they're so good for beadhead flies. Typically, it might be deeper water, so you need to get a good hook set. So having a stiffer rod helps in that area as well. So, and also being long, you can fish further away from you, obviously. Now, typically, when I think about using a Keiryu rod, in that method, it's more of a wide, slow pool, perhaps, or a long run that's relatively featureless and very slow. So if you were to cast it out like a Tenkara rod, at an angle, because it's moving, the water's moving so slow, it'll tend to drift back to you. So you're not getting a real good straight drift. You're going to get some drag there. With a very long rod, and you're fishing almost straight beneath the tip. So one of the ways you accomplish that is to use an overall line length that's shorter than the rod. Not as long or longer than the rod, because then you either have to cast further out, or you have to hold your rod way up in the air, and that's going to cause the line to be very close to you. So one of the first things to know when rigging up the Keiryu rod, for me, following Tenkara Bum's suggestions, so I use an overall line length that's shorter than the rod itself, rather than like with a Tenkara rod. The thumb rule is a line about the length of the rod, and then tip it beyond that. But with the Keiryu rod, I actually make it noticeably shorter. So for, let's say that if this was a 20-foot rod, I might make the overall tip to hook length about 4 feet shorter. And with a shorter rod, say a 4.5 meter Keiryu rod, I would make it about 3 feet shorter than the rod itself, perhaps maybe even 2 feet. So it's nothing hard and fast, but the basis for that is you want the line essentially to be hanging directly beneath the tip of the rod. So if you have a really long line for a given depth of water, you're going to have to hold your rod up high, and to hang straight down, that line is going to be very close to you. So by making it shorter, you can hold the rod more parallel to the water. You're not holding it parallel, but not as steep of an angle. And so the line is going to be further away from you. One of the benefits of having a very long rod. So why would you want to rig it in this way? If you have water that is slow, not a lot of features to it, it's hard to use the Keiryu rod or you know, as a big Tenkara rod, because with a long line you're casting far out and you're going to get some drape, and eventually that line's going to work its way back to you because the current where I typically use it is very slow and the water is kind of deep, so you're not going to get, you know, a really good dead drift, and that's kind of the whole purpose of it is getting the ultimate in dead drifts. So they use, you know, Tenkara talks about using really small, tiny, lightweight hooks, and also you're using as thin and small, you know, almost weightless of a line as you can get, because it provides better drift and looks more natural that way, and it's you know, harder to see, which can be hard on you, but it's better for the fish. So we have some ways that we work around the visibility for the fishermen. So the line itself is made in 3 parts is the way I do it. The upper part line is called the Tenjo line, and what I use for that, Tenkara sells this, and I'll put a picture up on the screen, but it's very small line. It's actually 1.25, so if you think normal level line is 3 or 3.5, this is 1.25, so it's high visibility, but obviously it's so thin that it's still hard to see. But the reason you want some of that up at the top is if you made it ultra light line, say, you know, 5, 6, 7x tippet all the way from the tip of the rod, that's going to get tangled and it's going to be a mess, and it's going to be very hard to untangle. So by having a little bit of weight, a little bit stiffer line, it's going to reduce the tangles that you're going to get, and if you do get tangles, it's a little easier to untie. And it provides a little bit of visibility as well. So for a rod, let's say 20 foot, I would have about 6 feet of that Tenjo line at the top, and then a tippet ring, and then the midsection. And for the midsection, I would just use, you know, typical tippet for that. The thumb rule I have, based on what the canopy around me, if there's trees behind me, kind of determine what's the likelihood that I'm going to get the rod tip up in the tree, or if a fish lets go, is it going to sling it up into a tree? Because if you think about it, you want a light line for one thing, but obviously you don't want a lot of break-offs. But if you have, let's say you put 3x there, and if the rod is rated for 5x and you get the 3x stuck up in a tree, you're kind of in a pinch. You're going to have some problems. So I will typically use tippet in the middle section of the rod, of the line that is the rating of the rod. So if this is a 5x, I'll use no stronger than 5x tippet in that middle section of line, and I'll talk about how long that middle section is in a second. So I might use 6x or 5x or 6x for this 5x rod, and then another tippet ring, and then you're going to have your actual weaker tippet at the bottom. So if I'm using 5x here, I'd use 6x on the bottom for the bottom section. In the middle section, you're going to have your yarn markers is what I use, and I'll talk about how to tie them on there. But because the line is so light and so difficult to see, this is going to be your indicator for strike, since this line will be invisible if you've got 6x, 5x tippet out there 20 feet from you. You're not going to be able to see it. So having these yarn markers and tying them, you can use 3 or 4 depending on your personal preference on your line. So so you have your Tenjo section, you have your middle section, which is longer typically, and that is where I'll have the yarn markers on that middle section above that bottom tippet ring. The reason for that is that lower section of tippet is going to be your weakest link, and so if you get a break off, it's going to break off below that tippet ring, so you lose your yarn markers. And you can't slide those yarn markers down below the tippet ring, so they're going to stay up in that area. But you don't want to lose more of your rig than you need to, and have to take the time to tie those on again. So the length of the tippet itself, the thumb rule that Chris talks about, is the minimum, the shallowest water depth. So if the water is, you know, between 3 to 5 feet, I'm going to have that bottom section about 3 feet, so the shallowest portion of the water. Now the reason for that, I mentioned, is if the tippet ring is on the bottom of this string here, for instance, and you've got your tippet down below, if you have 3 feet, when you go into 5 feet of water, you're going to lower your rod tip to get where you want. So those yarn markers can slide up and down very easily. And if you have too much tippet and you have to hold it too far off the water, your yarn markers are going to be too far above the water. You want them fairly close to the water to give you a better indication of where your line is, for one thing, but also strike indication. If it's too far up the line, it doesn't really do you as much good. So shortest length, the weakest link down there, the tippet, about the shallowest depth of the water. So that allows the flexibility to lower the rod, and you can just slide the yarn markers up the line. But if you hold it too high, you can't slide them down. So bottom line. So for a 20-foot rod, let's say I mentioned about 6 foot of Tenjo line. And then if it's 3 feet of water, so that's 6 plus 3 feet for the tippet, that leaves a total of 9 feet so far. And I mentioned about 3 to 4 feet shorter than the rod. So let's say I want 16 feet overall. So 6 plus 3 is 9, so that means that middle section is going to be 7 feet. So I'd have 6 feet of the 1.25 fluorescent high-vis fluorocarbon. I'd have 3 feet of, let's say, 5 or 6x tippet. And then I'm going to have that 7 feet of, say, 5x tippet, which is the minimum or the maximum rating for this rod. So sounds pretty complicated. It's really not. Just those 3 sections, one simple formula to determine how long each one is. But I use tippet rings for the 2 connections, and I have the yarn markers in that middle section. So how do you tie those yarn markers on? So let's say this is the glorified yarn marker here, and these particular ones that I buy, and I'll show the picture. It's just a spool of the yarn, so, and it has a little cutter built on the spool itself. So I'll take off one rotation and then cut it off and go from there. So I'll use that one rotation, and that will actually provide the length of 2 markers. I'll cut that in half. So if I'm using 2 colors, one rotation from each gives me 2 of each color, 4 yarn markers. So if this is my line, I'll alternate colors. I'll have that, you know, fluorescent green and green and orange, and they are super, super bright. I think in my videos they're still hard to see because they're still a long ways away in the lighting with the GoPro and stuff, but in person, those things are like little beacons of light. You will not miss them. So they are excellent. And you can really tell the angle of them if it changes at all, if a fish gets a very subtle take. And that's the beauty of this setup. You have slow moving water. The fish can be very, very subtle takes because they're just kind of sitting there and they're taking it in their mouth. So you're barely going to see that line move most of the time, and you're rarely going to feel it, just because they're sitting there, and if you hit them in the face with it, they're just going to take it in their mouth and then spit it out. So you have to be quick, but it really is the ultimate in drift and detection. So if this is my yarn marker, and let's say my finger here is the line itself. So again, this is the middle section, the 5x tippet. I'm going to put it around that 5x tippet, and then I'm going to go around twice, and then I'm just going to tie an overhand knot in it. And so what you'll have, and this doesn't stay tied very well, but then you can snip it off relatively close. You can leave it, you know, the tag ends as long as you want, but it does create more wind resistance, and quite frankly, you won't need that much visibility. So I'll cut them off pretty close, actually. And so you'll just have very, very slight tag end. But by doing it that way, wrapping it around a couple times with that overhand knot at the end, it makes it snug. It will stay, but it will allow you to slide it up and down the line as you need based on the depth of the water. So you can space them out whatever you feel like. I usually have them about that far apart, 3-4 of them, so over like a distance of that much. I'll have those 4 yarn markers, but you can space them as far as close as you want, or have as few as, or as many as you want on there, but you won't need, a half a dozen or anything like that. They're very bright. So anyways, that's how you do it. And Chris's website shows a good picture of it, and it kind of shows a picture on the back of these as well. It does it maybe slightly different, but I go around two extra times and then tie an overhand, pull it tight, and then I snip the ends with either with hemostats if they have a scissor blade on them, or you can just kind of nip them with your nippers as well. There's not really much else to it. If you have a bunch of Keiryu rods like I do, 20 feet down to, I have a little 9-foot Keiryu rods with the Traveler 27 too, but I don't use that for, in that Keiryu style. But you can have quite a few lines if you think about it, based on the water depth and if you have a multi-position rod. So you could potentially have a lot of different line setups if you want. You don't have to. I keep it relatively simple as far as that goes. If kind of one for each rod, it doesn't matter a whole lot. Where you could run into issues is if the water depth varies a lot, to where you need to go from deep water to shallower water, and you can't slide the yarn markers down enough, so you might have to shorten the tippet sections and that sort of stuff. So I actually use you can use the round line cards and spools and things like that. This I also got from Chris Stewart. So it's designed for Keiryu line setup. So kind of in the middle section here, you'll hook your hook on it and then wrap it around. They're very thin. The only concern I'll have is how much it will kink my line. But this particular package, it comes with 10 of these things, so you can have some for all of the rods, or different length positions of a given rod, or water depth. So it comes in a neat little package, but I haven't really used this much, so I'm not going to do a review or give it my recommendation yet till I give it a shot. But if you do have a bunch of rods, you may have quite a few of those lines, so whatever your preference is for line storage will work just fine. I hope that helps. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. And we've got another real cold spell coming in, probably 15 below zero for a few days this week. So I'm hoping to get out fishing real soon and have some more videos, but I'm getting anxious to get up in the mountains. And you're going to see some places that very few people get to, and the fishing is pretty spectacular. So thanks for hanging in there, and we'll be looking forward to spring. Talk to you soon.